1433 Blue Ash Road sits on a residential block in Whitehall, a suburb on the eastern edge of Columbus, Ohio, in early March 1984. The street is the kind of street that looks the same from one end to the other. Wood frame houses set back from the pavement on shallow lots. The yards narrow but tended, the driveways holding one car or two, the porch lights coming on at dusk in a slow progression down the block as the day closes and the inside lights take over. The house at 1433 is a two-story, indistinguishable from the houses beside it in the way that post-war suburban construction tends to produce indistinguishable things: the same roof pitch, the same window placement, the same relationship between the front door and the street. From the outside, in that first week of March, there is nothing about it worth a second look. It is a house where a family lives. It sits on its lot the way a house is supposed to sit, quietly, without drawing attention, the way most houses in most American neighborhoods sit through most of the year without becoming anything other than what they are. Inside the house at 1433 Blue Ash Road, the household in March 1984 is larger than a passing neighbor might guess. Joan and John Resch are the adults at the center of it. They have lived there long enough that the house is fully theirs in the way that only time makes a house feel, the way a particular kitchen table becomes the kitchen table, the way a particular corner of a room becomes the corner where certain things always are. John leaves for work on weekday mornings. Joan manages the household through the day. The rooms of the house are organized around the needs of people at different ages and stages, and there are more of those people than the exterior suggests. Several foster children placed by Franklin County Social Services are living in the home at this time. Children who have come through the county's system and been placed with the RESRIS, as other children have been placed with them across many years prior. A young man named Craig, who grew up in the household as a former foster child and has remained in some connection with the family into adulthood, is also part of the household's composition in this period. The kitchen table, according to any practical accounting of the lives under that roof, seats more people at mealtime than most of the neighboring households. The Reskes had been working with Franklin County Social Services as foster parents for a long time, before March 1984. The relationship was documented. The county kept records of placements, of reviews, of the assessments that determined which children were placed in which homes, and the Resches appear in those records as a household with a sustained history of taking in children who needed placement. Dozens of children over the years, according to accounts of their history with the program. This is not a household that came to the attention of county welfare agencies in March 1984 for the first time. The institutional relationship was already established, already long-standing, already part of the texture of how the house on Blue Ash Road functioned as a place in the world. Whatever was about to happen inside that house would happen inside a household that already had a relationship with institutional oversight, with documentation, with the particular kind of scrutiny that comes with being part of a county welfare system's placement network. That context existed before any of the events of March 1984 were reported. Tina Resch had been in the house her entire life. She was adopted as an infant and had grown up at 1433 Blue Ash Road. Through all the years, the household had been what it was, through the changing roster of foster children placed there, through the ordinary progression of seasons on a residential block in Whitehall, through the neighborhood school system, and the years that a child accumulates in a single place, until the place and the person are no longer separable in any practical sense. By March 1984, she was 14 years old. She knew the house the way a person can only know a place they have never not lived in, where the light falls in each room at different hours, which floorboards produce which sounds, how the house sounds at night when the household is asleep, and how it sounds in the morning when it is waking up again. Whatever the house was, she was part of it. It was, in any ordinary sense of the word, hers. The records from Tina's school history in the years before 1984 describe a young person whose relationship with the structured environment of the classroom had been difficult to characterize or to manage. Teacher accounts noted emotional outbursts. Administrators noted difficulty maintaining friendships and inconsistent academic performance across subjects and years. At various points, she had been referred for evaluation, learning assessments, behavioral assessments, the kind of institutional attention that school systems direct toward children whose presence in a classroom is difficult to account for within the ordinary frameworks those systems use. None of this is unusual in any dramatic sense. The documentation describes a 14-year-old whose school experience had been uneven and whose emotional life had been periodically difficult to contain within the expectations of the school day. It is the kind of record that exists for a significant number of children, recorded in the files of a significant number of school systems, without becoming the basis for any particular story. In the early days of March 1984, those records exist in whatever filing cabinet or folder holds them, and Tina Resch sits in a classroom where the fluorescent lights hum steadily at their particular frequency, and the school day moves through its periods the way school days do, and nothing about the situation requires anyone outside the family and the school system to pay any attention to the house on Blue Ash Road. John Resch leaves for work on a morning in early March 1984. The way he leaves for work on any weekday morning, the door closes, the car backs out. The block settles into its daytime configuration, the houses with working adults now emptied of them, the houses with children still full of the sounds of morning routine. Joan remains in the house with the children still at home. The rooms are as they are every morning, the kitchen table set for breakfast, the ordinary objects on their ordinary surfaces, the lamp in the living room where the lamp always is, the telephone on its surface where the telephone always is. Outside, a neighbor might pass on the sidewalk without looking at the house. A car might slow at the stop sign at the end of the block and then move on. The street is quiet in the particular way of residential streets at mid-morning in a Midwestern suburb in early spring, when the winter has not quite finished, and the trees are still bare, and the light has the flat quality of March before the season has turned. Nothing about the exterior of 1433 Blue Ash Road signals anything to anyone passing by. The house sits on its lot, with the stillness of a house that has always been there and will continue to be there, which is to say, it sits the way houses always sit, without expression, without any quality that makes it different from the houses on either side. It is useful, before anything else, to sit for a moment with the specific geography of the neighborhood. Whitehall is not a place that appears in many accounts of American life. It is not a famous suburb, not a neighborhood with a particular cultural identity that would make it recognizable to someone living on the other side of the country. It is a working-class area east of Columbus, Ohio, built in the decades after the Second World War, when the American suburb was expanding outward from city centers in a wave of wood frame construction on residential lots of modest size. The houses were built to be affordable and durable, and they were both. The neighborhood that grew up around them was the kind of neighborhood that sustains itself on the ordinary rhythms of working families. The school calendar, the church calendar, the seasonal changes in the yard, the gradual accumulation of shared history that makes people on a street recognize each other without necessarily knowing each other well. Blue Ash Road is a street in that neighborhood. The house at 1433 is a house on that street. In the early days of March 1984, before anything had been reported, it belonged entirely to its context, a wood frame house in a working-class suburb of Columbus, Ohio, with a family inside it and a street outside it that was quiet in the way that street was always quiet. The relationship between Joan and John Resch and Franklin County's social services was by 1984 a long institutional relationship built on a documented track record of taking in children. The county placed children in homes that had been reviewed and approved, and the Resch home had been reviewed and approved many times over many years. Whatever the dynamics of any particular placement, the household operated within a framework of institutional oversight and county review that made it, in the formal sense, a known quantity to the agencies that directed children into it. The foster children in the home in March 1984 were there because the county had determined the placement was appropriate and the home was suitable. That determination had been made through the ordinary processes of the county welfare system, interviews, home visits, the kind of institutional assessment that generates paperwork and files. By March 1984, the Rischis were experienced foster parents with an established relationship with the agencies that made those placements, and the house on Blue Ash Road was an established placement in the county's network of foster homes. This is the context in which the events of March 1984 unfolded, a house already embedded in institutional relationships, already known to county agencies, already part of a documented and ongoing arrangement with the local welfare system. The city of Columbus in March 1984 is a mid-sized Midwestern city in the middle of an ordinary winter, turning toward spring. The Ohio State University campus sits to the north of the downtown. The river moves through the city without drawing much attention. The residential neighborhoods spread east and west of the central city in the way that Midwestern cities spread. Flat, grid-organized, the streets named and numbered in systems that tell you roughly where you are, without requiring any particular knowledge of local geography. Whitehall sits within the eastern spread of that grid. Its streets have the names of residential streets. Blue Ash Road, the house at 1433, has a street number that places it somewhere in the middle of the block. In a city of that size, on a street of that kind, in a neighborhood of that character, the address is completely unremarkable. It is a Columbus address among many Columbus addresses, in a residential neighborhood among many residential neighborhoods, on a block that does not distinguish itself from the surrounding blocks in any way that a city map would reveal. This is where Tina Resch lives in March 1984. This is where her entire life has taken place, up to this point. What is known about the period immediately preceding the events that would eventually bring outside attention to the house is mostly the kind of thing that is known about any family, in any house, in any residential neighborhood. The outlines of routine, the broad shape of how the household organizes itself, the institutional record that the school system and county welfare agencies maintain. The interior life of the house in the weeks and months before March 1984 is not something that gets preserved in any formal record. The conversations at the kitchen table, the particular tensions and accommodations that a large household with children at many different ages develops over time, the ordinary emotional weather of a family in a working-class suburb in the middle of winter, none of this is documented in any file that later investigators could review. What the documentary record preserves is the outward-facing information, the school reports, the county placement records, the address on a residential block in Whitehall. The interior of the house before March 1984 belongs to the people who lived there, and what they remember of it is theirs alone. Tina Resch at 14 is a young person with a school history that places her at some distance from the standard expectations of the classroom environment. The outburst teachers noted, the friendship difficulties administrators observed, the inconsistent academic performance that recurs across the records. These are the kinds of observations that school systems make about children whose inner life does not translate smoothly into the structured demands of the school day. They are not unusual observations. They are the observations that appear in many school files for many children, and their presence in Tina's record places her in a category of children whose experience of the institutional environment is difficult, not in a category that requires any particular additional explanation. She is 14 years old in March 1984, living in a house she has always lived in a neighborhood she has always known, attending schools in a system that has noted her difficulties without being able to fully account for them. That is the shape of her life, as the documentary record presents it in the period before any of the events on Blue Ash Road were reported to anyone outside the family, and what the household managed by Joan Resch in the early days of March 1984 is in every observable way a household functioning within its normal parameters. The foster children placed by Franklin County are being cared for. The adults are managing the logistics of a large household, the meals, the schedules, the transportation, the ongoing contact with county agencies that the foster care arrangement requires. Craig, the young adult who grew up in the home and has remained in some connection with it, is present in whatever way he is present. John leaves for work. Joan manages the house. Tina goes to school and comes home. The street outside is quiet in the way it is always quiet. The porch light comes on at dusk. The inside lights come on as the rooms are occupied and go off as the rooms are vacated. The telephone sits on its surface. The lamps sit on their surfaces. The circuit breaker panel, in whatever utility space the house contains, holds the wiring of the house in its organized and ordinary configuration. This is the house on Blue Ash Road in the first days of March 1984. Not yet anything other than what it appears to be, not yet known to anyone outside the family and the county agencies and the school system, not yet a place that anyone outside Whitehall has any reason to know the address of. Columbus Southern Power was the local electrical utility that served the residential neighborhoods of Whitehall in 1984. The company maintained the infrastructure that brought electricity into the houses on Blue Ash Road and the surrounding blocks. The lines, the transformers, the connections to the residential panels inside each house, where the household circuits were organized and fused. In the early days of the reported disturbances, the Resch's contacted Columbus Southern Power, and a utility inspector came to the house to examine the wiring. This is the kind of response a utility company makes when a customer reports anomalous behavior from lights and appliances. An inspector comes, walks through the home, examines the panel, checks the connections, measures the supply. It is a procedural response, a professional assessment. The inspector who came to 1433 Blue Ash Road worked through the house methodically, the way utility inspectors do, checking each circuit and connection against the standard of what a properly functioning residential installation should look like. The tools an inspector brings to a residential inspection are the tools of a trade that exist precisely to identify faults in electrical systems. Meters, test equipment, the accumulated knowledge of what a wiring problem looks like when a professional is looking for it. The inspector found nothing. This is the fact that sits at the end of his visit, after he has worked through the panel and checked the connections and measured the supply. No fault. The house is wired as a house of its age and type should be wired. The circuits are functioning within normal parameters. The connections are what they should be. There is no defect that the inspector's examination can identify that would account for light switching on and off in multiple rooms without anyone touching the switches, or for appliances behaving in ways that their wiring should not permit. The inspection is thorough. The finding is the same. The inspector packs his tools and leaves, and the house on Blue Ash Road is left with a completed utility inspection and no explanation. The lights in the house continue to flicker after the inspector has gone. What this means in strict evidentiary terms is modest but specific. It means that a professional examination of the home's electrical infrastructure, conducted by a qualified representative of the local utility company, produced no finding that accounted for the reported anomalies. It does not mean that no electrical explanation exists. An inspector working from the outside of a residential wiring system can only find what is visible and measurable from that approach. It means that the specific inspection conducted found no specific fault. The lights continue after the inspector leaves, and the family is left with the finding that the house has been examined and found to be, electrically, as it should be, and with the experience of lights doing things that the electrical system, as examined, should not permit. From the street, the house at 1433 Blue Ash Road looks exactly as it has always looked. The exterior is unchanged. The porch light will come on at dusk. The surrounding neighborhood continues at its ordinary pace. The cars on the street, the neighbors in their own houses, the rhythms of a residential block in Whitehall in early March. Nothing about the outside of the house tells anyone passing by what has been happening inside it, or what the utility inspector found when he left, or what the family is managing in the rooms that face the street with their windows and their lights. The house is a wood-frame two-story on a residential block in a working-class Columbus suburb, and from the outside it is, as it has always been, completely indistinguishable from the houses on either side of it. Inside, Joan Resch is in one of the rooms where the lights have been going on and off without anyone at the switches. She is managing a household that now has an additional fact in it. A qualified professional has examined the wiring and found nothing wrong. The lamps are where they always are. The telephone is on its surface. The foster children are somewhere in the house. Tina is at whatever hour this is, somewhere in the house. The walls are the walls they have always been. The floors are the floors Tina has walked across for her entire life. The circuit breaker panel is as the inspector left it, examined, found correct, closed. The house holds all of these things in its ordinary rooms and sits on its ordinary lot on an ordinary street. And outside on Blue Ash Road, the day moves forward the way days do in early March in Ohio, flat lit and cool, the trees bare, the neighborhood quiet, the house at 1433 completely still from the outside, giving nothing away. The inspector's finding is a document in a sense even if it never becomes a formal record consulted by later researchers. It is a finding that the family carries forward from that visit, a professional assessment that placed the house's wiring in the category of normal, which means that whatever explanation might eventually be offered for what was happening in the rooms of 1433 Blue Ash Road, it would not be the simplest one. The lights go on and the lights go off in rooms where no one is touching the switches, and the utility company has looked at the wiring and found it sound, and the house sits on its lot as the afternoon light moves across its exterior in the way that afternoon light moves across wood frame houses in Midwestern suburbs in early March, without drama, without announcement. Flat and pale and unremarkable, the kind of light that falls on every house on the block equally that makes no distinctions, that illuminates the house at 1433, the same way it illuminates every other house on Blue Ash Road, the same way it has illuminated them for as long as they have been standing there. This is where the case begins, not with any dramatic event, not with anything that could be photographed or measured or formally reported in those first days. It begins in a house on a residential block in Whitehall, Ohio, where a family is living their lives and a utility inspector has found no fault, and the lights are continuing to do something that the inspection should have explained and did not. And the house looks from the outside exactly as it has always looked, indistinguishable from its neighbors. The porch light ready to come on at dusk as it always does. The street outside quiet, the early March sky over Columbus flat and wide and holding no particular color as the afternoon continues toward evening, and the household at 1433 Blue Ash Road moves through the hours of a day that is in most respects exactly like any other day, except that somewhere in the rooms of the house something is happening that no one yet has an account for, and the finding that the inspector left behind. No fault, nothing wrong, the wiring as it should be, will remain in the family's knowledge of the situation for the days and weeks ahead, the beginning of a record that will, in time, extend well beyond the street and the suburb and the city where the wood frame house sits quietly in the particular stillness of a residential block in early spring. In the early days of March 1984, Joan Resch was standing in a room at 1433 Blue Ash Road when the lights went out. No one was at the switch. The room went dark, and then, a moment later, came back on, the overhead fixture resuming its ordinary steady presence as though nothing had changed. Joan stood where she was. The house was quiet around her. The lights in the hallway did the same thing, and then the lights in the kitchen, and she moved through the rooms checking the switches the way anyone would, touching each one in turn, finding them all in the positions they should have been in, finding nothing that explained what she had watched happen. That was how she would later describe the beginning of it. Not a single dramatic event, but a series of small ones, accumulating over the first few days of March with a quality she found difficult to account for, each incident minor enough on its own to dismiss as electrical quirk or coincidence, the total of them harder to set aside. The lights in multiple rooms, switches she had not touched, appliances she had not turned on, a house that had been quiet and ordinary for years, behaving in these early days in ways that were difficult to fit inside any ordinary category. The household she was managing at the time was a full one. Tina, who was 14, was there. Several children placed by Franklin County Social Services were there. The rhythms of a large household structured around foster care had shaped daily life on Blue Ash Road for years, and Joan Resch was someone practiced at maintaining those rhythms under varying conditions. What the lights were doing in early March did not fit inside any of those conditions. It did not fit inside any category she had a name for. She stood in the kitchen, or the hallway, or the living room, and the switches were where they belonged, and the explanation was not. The reported disturbances in those first days were electrical in character. That was how the family described them initially, and that was the frame they reached for first, the way anyone would reach first for the explanation that required the least reorganization of the world as they understood it. An electrical fault. A problem with the wiring in an older house in a residential neighborhood where the wiring in many houses had been laid decades before. Something in the system producing anomalous behavior in the fixtures. Joan and John Resch called Columbus Southern Power, and the utility company sent an inspector to the house on Blue Ash Road, and the inspector worked through the wiring and the circuit panels and the fixtures and found nothing wrong. The house, according to his assessment, was wired as it should be. The lights had not been flickering because of anything the inspection could locate. The inspector completed his survey and left. The lights in the house continued to flicker after he was gone. That detail, the inspection finding nothing, the phenomena continuing regardless, was the first indication that the Blue Ash Road situation was not going to settle into an electrical explanation and close. Joan Resch stood in her house with the inspector's assessment and a set of ongoing reported events that his assessment did not account for, and the gap between those two things was not small. It was the gap between having a framework and not having one. It was the gap between a house with a wiring problem, which is a solvable and manageable thing, and a house with something else occurring inside it, which is a different kind of situation entirely. The phenomena that were being reported in those early weeks were not consistent with any single pattern she could trace. The lights were part of it, but other things were being reported too. Objects in the house were behaving in ways that the family found difficult to explain. A lamp in one of the rooms tilted and went over without anyone standing near it. The way Joan would later describe watching this was not with language of drama or fright, but with the language of someone trying to accurately report what had happened. The lamp went over. She had not been near it. She stood in the room for a moment before picking it up. That interval, the standing still, the taking in of what had just happened, recurs in accounts of the early March period with a quality of genuine disorientation, the ordinary gesture of a person whose environment has done something outside her reckoning. Small appliances in the house were reported to have activated independently. Cups and decorative objects were reported to have moved from the surfaces they had been placed on, traveling distances that could not be accounted for by vibration or settling. These were the kinds of reports that in isolation would be easy to receive with skepticism, the kind of thing that can shade quickly into the category of mistaken memory or faulty attention. What made them harder to set aside in the early March period at Blue Ash Road was the repetition and variety of them. Not one object, not one kind of incident, but a pattern of small reported displacements and activations across different rooms and different hours of the day, clustering around the presence of Tina in a way that the family had begun to notice before anyone outside the house had been told anything. The telephone handset was among the objects that received specific attention in the family's early accounts. A telephone on its surface in a room of the house, cord coiled, receiver in its cradle, the kind of fixture that occupies a domestic space so reliably it becomes invisible, part of the furniture of daily life, so familiar it does not register as an object at all until it does something unexpected. What the family reported was that the telephone handset did not stay where it had been placed, that the receiver would leave its cradle, would travel, would end up somewhere other than where it had been. The specific language of family accounts from this period varies in its particulars, but the phone appears in multiple early descriptions of the anomalous events, receiving the same quality of attention as the lamps and the cups and the small appliances, logged as a thing that had done something it should not have done in a house full of things doing exactly that. The family's response in the days that followed the failed electrical inspection was not to call the press or to bring in outside investigators. That came later, and it came through a more gradual process than dramatic incident alone. What happened in the 2 weeks following the initial disturbances was something quieter and more private, a family inside a house on a residential street in Whitehall, trying to make sense of what their house was doing, reaching first for the explanations closest to hand and finding them insufficient, and then reaching for the next category of help available to them, which was the church and the community. Joan Resch, by later account, talked to people she trusted. She talked to members of her congregation. She described what had been happening in the house, speaking in the measured way of someone who is aware that what they are saying is unusual and who is accustomed to having their credibility count for something in the communities they move through. It is worth staying with that image for a moment. Joan Resch in March 1984, sitting with a member of her congregation, describing the events of the past 2 weeks in the domestic interior of a church community. The conversation taking place in person, in the unhurried way of communities where people still talked through difficulties before they looked further afield for guidance. She was not making a public claim. She was not contacting newspapers or researchers. She was doing what people in her situation had always done, which was to talk to someone she knew about something she did not understand, and to see whether the talking itself produced any clarity. It did not produce a resolution. It produced the beginning of a chain of communication that moved through the community faster than Joan had anticipated. Word traveled the way it travels in neighborhoods and congregations, person to person, the account changing slightly with each transmission, acquiring the shape that past accounts tend to acquire, more dramatic in the retelling than in the original. By the time the story reached ears that would bring it to the attention of the Columbus Dispatch, it had passed through enough intermediaries that the original texture of Joan Resch's careful domestic account had been somewhat altered, given the sharper edges that stories acquire when they move through networks. The Columbus Dispatch, one of Ohio's major daily newspapers, heard enough to assign a reporter and a photographer to the story. It was a feature assignment at that point, not a breaking news dispatch. The kind of story that city desks occasionally handle when a community report of an unusual domestic situation reaches a threshold of local interest. A reporter with a notebook, a photographer with a camera. Blue Ash Road was about to receive its first visitors, who came not with toolboxes, but with professional instruments of a different kind. In those same days, while word was spreading through community channels, and while the assignment was being made at the Columbus Dispatch, the house on Blue Ash Road was continuing as it had been. The fixtures were behaving as they had been. The objects in the rooms were doing what they had been reported to do. Nothing about the physical situation had changed because people were beginning to talk about it. And the house stood on its block in Whitehall, the same way it had always stood. 2 stories, wood frame, the porch light coming on at dusk, the street outside, quiet in the way that residential streets in mid-sized American cities were quiet on weekday evenings in early spring. Whatever was being reported inside had not altered its outward appearance or its position among its neighbors. The interior situation was the one that had changed, or the interior situation was the one that the family was reporting had changed. That distinction between a situation that had changed and a situation being reported as having changed was one that would become important when investigators arrived. But in the days before investigators arrived, it was simply the daily condition of the household, a set of unexplained incidents accumulating in a specific domestic space, occupied by specific people, whose ordinary lives had acquired a dimension none of them had anticipated. Joan Resch had been managing a household of this size and complexity for years. The work of foster care, of coordinating with county services, of maintaining the structure that a large household of children required, was work she knew and was competent at. The disturbances that began in early March 1984 were not something her competence extended to. There was no protocol for them, no prior experience to draw on, no category of domestic management that covered what was happening to the furniture and the fixtures in her house. The electrical inspection had not resolved it. the private electrician whom the family also brought in a few days after the Columbus Southern Power Inspector had completed his survey, worked through the same wiring and panels and fixtures, and arrived at the same finding. Nothing wrong, no defect identifiable. The house wired correctly as far as either professional could determine. Two separate professional assessments, conducted independently in the same house, both ending at the same place. No electrical explanation for what was being reported. That second inspection, the private electrician, the same methodical survey, the same result, is a detail worth holding. It is not a detail that resolves anything. It is a detail that deepens the specific shape of the evidentiary situation at Blue Ash Road, which was a situation in which the most available and most ordinary class of explanation had been applied twice and had come back negative twice. The phenomena, as reported by the family, continued regardless. The wiring was fine, the lights continued, the objects continued. The gap between the institutional assessment of the house and the lived experience being reported by its occupants did not close after the second inspection. It remained exactly where it had been, measured in the same distance between what the professionals found and what the family said was happening. The reported incidents during this 2-week window before the dispatch arrived had a quality that later investigators would note as consistent with a particular profile of domestic disturbance report, the poltergeist report profile, as it had been described in the literature of parapsychological research. Not because the Blue Ash Road events were being evaluated against that literature in March 1984. They were not yet. That analysis came later, but because the characteristics of the reported events fit within a pattern that had been documented across many decades and in many countries, and repetitive, involving a wide variety of household objects, not concentrated in a single room or a single type of incident, but distributed across the domestic space in ways that made any single mundane explanation difficult to apply. A lamp falling and a telephone moving and an appliance activating independently are three separate kinds of events. Accounting for all three simultaneously with the same ordinary explanation requires a degree of ordinary explanation that early March at Blue Ash Road was not supplying. Investigators who would later review the full list of reported incidents from this period would also note the way the events appeared to cluster around Tina's physical location within the house. That is a detail the family had themselves begun to observe before any outside investigator arrived. It was noted in the early community accounts that made their way through Joan's congregation. It was part of the shape of the story that had reached the Columbus Dispatch before the reporter and photographer were dispatched. It was not a conclusion, but an observation, the kind of pattern that becomes visible when enough incidents have accumulated that the spatial distribution of them can be examined. And in the early March period at Blue Ash Road, enough incidents had accumulated by the time the dispatch assignment was made that a spatial distribution was visible to anyone who had been present for them. Tina herself, in this period, was a 14-year-old in a household that had become unusual. The daily life of Blue Ash Road in early March 1984 had not been ordinary for some weeks, and she was at the center of the reported strangeness in a way that the family was aware of and that the community accounts, as they spread, would make more explicit. What that experience was like from the inside, from her position in the house, surrounded by these reported events, watched by a family that was trying to understand what was happening and why it appeared to follow her from room to room, is not something the record at this point fully captures. The family accounts describe the events. They do not describe in detail the interior experience of the person around whom the events were clustering. The household went on. The foster children placed by Franklin County Services continued their routines. John Resch went to work in the mornings. Joan managed the daily configuration of a large and complex household under conditions that were no longer ordinary. The rooms of the house at 1433 Blue Ash Road held their occupants in the way rooms do: the kitchen for meals, the living room for the hours between activities, the bedrooms at night, and in those rooms the objects on the surfaces were behaving as the family reported they were behaving, and no inspection had found an explanation for it, and the congregation had been told, and the word had spread, and a reporter and a photographer had been assigned. What the objects were doing on those surfaces, according to the family's accounts, had not diminished or resolved in the days since the electrical inspections. The frequency and variety of reported incidents in the 2 weeks between the first disturbances and the dispatch assignment appears, in later reconstructions from family and community accounts, to have been roughly consistent, not escalating dramatically in the way that dramatic retellings of such cases tend to suggest, not fading in the way one might expect if the disturbances had been the product of some localized and decaying cause, but persisting at a level that was enough to sustain the family's concern and to keep the community conversation active. This is the shape of a situation that does not resolve on its own and does not settle back into normalcy, a situation that accumulates instead of dissipating, and the accumulation was what made the Blue Ash Road events, by mid to late March 1984, something the Columbus Dispatch considered worth sending a team to document. The telephone in its cradle, the lamp on its surface, the fixtures in the rooms the inspector had checked. All of these ordinary objects in their ordinary positions in a wood frame house on a residential block in Whitehall, Ohio, occupying the domestic space in the way that objects in a family home occupy domestic space, so familiar as to be invisible, so reliably in place that their presence registers only when their presence is suddenly elsewhere. That is the specific quality of the reported events at Blue Ash Road in early March 1984. Not the grand displacement, but the small one. Not the spectacular event, but the persistent and mundane wrongness of things not being where they had been put, of switches in the right position and rooms going dark anyway, of inspectors finding nothing and the house continuing to do what it had been doing, regardless. Joan Resch, somewhere in the third week of March 1984, had spoken to her congregation, and the word had gone further than she expected, and now there was going to be a newspaper involved. That was the situation. The house was what it had always been on the outside: 2-story, wood frame, unremarkable among its neighbors on Blue Ash Road, a porch light, windows, the street in front of it, quiet at the hours it was always quiet. Inside, the family and the reported events and the accumulation of 2 weeks of unexplained incidents that 2 separate professional inspections had not accounted for. The newspaper was coming. The camera was coming. The house, from the outside, looked as it always had, the same as the houses around it on the block, and gave no indication from the street of what had been reported inside it, and what continued, by all accounts, to occur. The circuit breaker in the house on Blue Ash Road sat in its panel the way circuit breakers sit in panels. Each fuse in its housing, the ratings printed on the plastic casings in the small font used on electrical equipment, the whole assembly behind a metal door in a utility area or a hallway, the kind of infrastructure that is never looked at until something requires looking at it. 2 professionals had opened that door and worked through its contents and found them as they should be: the fuses intact, the wiring behind the panel running correctly through the walls of the house to the fixtures in the rooms. The fixtures in the rooms had not received this assessment as instruction. The lights continued to do what they had been doing. The The objects continued to do what they had been doing. The panel sat behind its door and continued to show nothing wrong. There is something specific about that image, the inspector's finding of nothing, the phenomena continuing anyway, that captures the particular condition of the Blue Ash Road situation in its early weeks. It is the condition of a gap that ordinary explanation has already been applied to and has already failed to close. The wiring was not the explanation. That had been established twice by two separate professionals on two separate visits. What was not established was what the explanation was, and the gap between those two states, between a refuted explanation and a found one, was the space the family was occupying in early March 1984, moving through the rooms of their house, managing the daily life of a large household, and waiting without quite knowing what they were waiting for. The Columbus Dispatch's decision to assign a team to the story was made on the far side of a chain of community communication that had begun with Joan Resch describing events in her home to people she trusted. That chain had covered the distance between a family and a city desk in the way such chains cover distance. Not quickly, but steadily, the story accumulating credibility or interest or both as it moved through different hands until it reached someone at the paper who decided it was worth the assignment. A reporter and a photographer. Standard feature coverage. Blue Ash Road was the destination. The family was the subject. The events being reported in the house were the story. The house itself did not know this. The street outside it was quiet. The porch light came on at dusk. The phenomena that had been reported in those 2 weeks before the dispatch arrived, the lights, the lamps, the phone, the cups, the appliances, would become, in the weeks and months to come, the subject of significant investigative attention and significant public scrutiny, evaluated from multiple directions by people with conflicting methodologies and conflicting interpretive frameworks. But in the days immediately before the dispatch assignment was made, they were simply a domestic record inside a specific house, witnessed primarily by the family who lived there and by the community members Joan had spoken to. They were a set of reported incidents in a space that had been electrically inspected twice and found normal, a house that continued to behave abnormally by the account of its occupants, an address on a residential block in Whitehall that had not yet appeared in any newspaper or on any investigator's file. The reporter had a notebook. The photographer had a camera. The editor had made the assignment. On the other side of the city, at 1433 Blue Ash Road, the house sat on its block as it always had, and the street was quiet, and the objects in the rooms were where they had been placed or were reported to be somewhere else, and a family was moving through the daily configuration of a large household in early spring in Columbus, Ohio, with no explanation for what their house had been doing, and a newspaper team on its way. Fred Shannon arrived at 1433 Blue Ash Road on the morning of March 21st, 1984, carrying a film camera and the standard equipment of a working press photographer on a feature assignment. He was a staff photographer for the Columbus Dispatch. The house on Blue Ash Road looked the way it had always looked from the outside, a 2-story wood-frame structure on a residential street in Whitehall. Nothing about its exterior distinguishing it from the houses on either side. The late March light falling across the front of it in the way that light falls across houses on quiet suburban streets in Ohio in the last week of winter, flat and gray and without particular drama. Shannon had been sent to document what was happening inside, and he came to it the way a working press photographer comes to any assignment, with equipment, with patience, and with the specific attentiveness of someone whose job is to wait in a room until something worth photographing presents itself. The assignment had come to Shannon through the ordinary channels of a mid-sized American daily newspaper in 1984. An editor had decided the story on Blue Ash Road was worth covering with photographs. Shannon had been given the address, had been told what the family was reporting, and had driven out to Whitehall with his camera bag and his film stock to spend several hours in the home observing. Feature photography of this kind involves a particular quality of sustained attention, not the urgent responsiveness of news photography at a scene, but something slower and more patient, closer to the way a documentarian works, waiting in the rooms of a household for the household to become itself in front of the camera. Shannon spent several hours at the house on March 21st. He moved through the rooms with his camera. He waited. The photograph he took that morning, or that afternoon, the precise hour not established in the record with certainty, shows Tina Resch seated in a chair. Her hands are visible, resting in her lap or at her sides, not raised toward the object that appears in the frame near her. To her right, at approximately the height of her face, a telephone handset occupies a position in the air that the photograph presents without comment, the handset simply there, in the air, at that height, at that angle, with nothing visibly connecting it to the surface it would ordinarily rest on. Tina's expression in the photograph is not composed. It reads in the way that a photograph's emotional content is read, which is to say, imperfectly and always with some projection from the viewer, as startled or distressed or caught in the middle of something she did not expect. Her hands are at her sides. The handset is in the air. That is what the photograph shows. It shows those things and no more than those things, and those things in the photograph are simply present, documented in the emulsion of standard press film, on a standard press film camera, on a day in late March 1984 in a house in Whitehall, Ohio. The film was processed in the Columbus Dispatch darkroom in the way that all press film was processed in 1984, developed in chemical baths, the latent image made visible, the frames fixed on the strip of emulsion in the way that photographic images were fixed before the digital era introduced a different set of questions about what authentication meant. The negative of Shannon's photograph existed as a physical object after processing. The image on it was a product of light falling on film through a lens on a specific afternoon in a specific room. The authentication of press photographs in that era rested on the film negative itself, on the chain of custody from camera to darkroom to print, and on the professional credibility of the photographer whose name was attached to it. Shannon's name was on this one. He was a working staff photographer at a regional daily newspaper, with the professional identity that carries, not a freelancer operating without institutional accountability, not an anonymous source, but a named employee of a named publication who had arrived at the house on an assigned job and had come back with film. The Columbus Dispatch editors who looked at that photograph in the newsroom after processing were making a decision of a particular kind. The image in front of them showed on its face something that the paper's reporters had been covering in the surrounding text. The reports from the Resch family about objects moving without contact, the electrical inspections that had found nothing, the word spreading through community and church networks about what was happening at the house on Blue Ash Road. The photograph appeared to show one of the reported events. The handset was in the air. Tina's hands were at her sides. The question an editor holds when looking at an image like that one is not simple, not a question of whether the photograph is technically a photograph, which it was, but a question of what publishing it asserts, what it implies, and what responsibility the paper takes on by putting it on the front page above the fold. The Dispatch made the decision to publish. The photograph ran on or around March 22nd, 1984. It ran on the front page, and it ran with Shannon's credit and it ran in a newspaper that had a readership in Columbus, Ohio, and in the surrounding region, the ordinary distribution of a regional daily. The internal discussion that preceded that decision is not fully documented in the public record. What was said in the newsroom, what arguments were made, which editor made the final call. What is documented is the outcome. The photograph was published, and once it was published, it was no longer contained within the readership of the Columbus Dispatch, or within the city of Columbus, or within the state of Ohio. Wire Services in 1984 moved photographs across the country and to international subscribers through transmission systems that took an image from the city where it originated and placed it on the desks of editors at subscribing papers in other cities within hours or days. Shannon's photograph was picked up by Wire Services and transmitted outward from Columbus. The image traveled not in any dramatic or metaphorical sense, but in the literal mechanical sense of a photograph moving through the transmission infrastructure of the mid-1980s American press, duplicated and sent, arriving at desks in other newsrooms where editors who had no knowledge of Whitehall, no familiarity with the house on Blue Ash Road, no prior awareness of Joan and John Resch, or of Tina, or of the reports that had been accumulating through March 1984. Editors who had none of that context now held the photograph in their hands or on their light tables and looked at it. What they looked at was this: a teenage girl seated in a chair in what appeared to be a domestic interior, her hands at her sides, and a telephone handset suspended in the air to her right at face height. No wires visible, no hands touching it. The expression on her face reading as surprise or distress, the image clear, well exposed, without the blur or grain that would suggest motion or technical difficulty. A photograph that looked to any eye trained on press photography like a properly taken press photograph, with all the technical characteristics of an image produced by an experienced professional on standard equipment under ordinary conditions, except for the object in the air. Newspapers and television news programs across the United States ran the photograph or covered the story it had come from. Several publications in other countries received and ran it. The case that had begun in a neighborhood in Whitehall in early March 1984, known at first only to the Resch family and their immediate community, then to the Columbus Dispatch and its readership, now had a presence in the wider national and international press that the house on Blue Ash Road, from the outside, gave no indication of. The street was still a residential street. The house still looked like its neighbors. The attention the photograph drew included the attention of parapsychological researchers who had been monitoring the Columbus press coverage and who now had a widely circulated image to consider alongside the reported incidents. It also included the attention of James Randi, who was among the most prominent professional skeptics working in the United States in 1984, and who had made a public practice of responding to media coverage of claimed paranormal events with rigorous challenges and detailed public skepticism. Randi's response to the Shannon photograph and to the Columbus Dispatch coverage was prompt and in its substance consistent with the position he had maintained across his career. The reported events and the photograph were, in his assessment, consistent with a troubled adolescent performing deliberate deceptions for attention, and the coverage represented a failure of skeptical scrutiny on the part of the press. The cash prize challenge he had standing for verified demonstrations of paranormal activity was noted in his response as available, as it had been for years, for anyone at Blue Ash Road who could demonstrate the reported phenomena under controlled conditions. Randi's response was documented and public. It entered the record of the case as a named position from a named individual, held consistently and argued from a specific methodological framework. The photograph, in his analysis, was not evidence that the handset had moved without physical causation. It was evidence that a photograph had been taken, and what a photograph showed and what had caused the arrangement of objects within it were separate questions. The photograph showed what it showed. Shannon's professional identity and the physical film negative established what kind of document it was. A press photograph taken by a named staff photographer on standard equipment in a documented place on a documented date. Those facts were not in question. The question the photograph opened, and did not on its own close, was the question of what it showed was happening and what had caused the handset to be where it was when the shutter opened. Those were not questions the photograph could answer. They were questions that the photograph held open, in the same way that the image held the handset in the air, suspended, documented, unresolved. Shannon had spent several hours in the house on March 21st. He had moved through the rooms. He had positioned himself and his camera in the various spaces of the domestic interior. He had done what press photographers do on feature assignments, waited for the environment to produce something that justified the trip in the film. Whether the image he returned with was the product of a moment he witnessed, or a moment that occurred while he was present but not directly observing, or something that Tina or someone else in the household staged for the camera, these questions also remained part of the record without final resolution. Shannon's account of the moment the photograph was taken was filed through the normal channels of press photography and press reporting. The photograph and his account of its circumstances were both part of the public record from the days following publication. The image that arrived in those other newsrooms, the ones in cities whose editors had no knowledge of Whitehall, carried with it only what was visible in the frame. The context that might have shaded how an editor read it was not encoded in the photograph itself. The house on Blue Ash Road was not in the frame. The residential street was not in the frame. The weeks of preceding reports, the electrical inspections, Joan Resch's calls to her church, the slow accumulation of incidents through early March, none of that was in the frame. In the frame was Tina and her hands and the handset and the air between them. That image, those particular visual elements in that particular arrangement, fixed on press film on a specific afternoon in late March 1984 in Columbus, Ohio, became the primary document of the Tina Resch case in the weeks and months that followed its publication. Not because it proved anything that could not be disputed, not because it resolved the questions the family and their community had been living with for weeks, but because photographs have a particular kind of persistence in the public record, and because this one showed something that could not be unremarkable, and because the wire services had carried it outward from Columbus into a readership that was now substantially larger than the neighborhood on Blue Ash Road. The Columbus Dispatch front page from around March 22nd, 1984, exists as a physical object, newsprint, ink, the specific typography of a regional daily from the mid-1980s, somewhere in whatever archive holds the paper's back issues. The photograph on it is Shannon's. The handset is in the air. Tina's hands are at her sides. The edition was printed in the ordinary quantity of a regional daily's print run and distributed through the ordinary channels. Some copies were kept, some were not. The ones that survive are the physical record of the day the Dispatch made its editorial decision, and the case on Blue Ash Road left the neighborhood and entered the wider record. Fred Shannon's name is attached to the photograph in the published credits. In the small professional world of regional press photography in 1984, his name carried the weight that a working staff photographer's name carries. Not famous, not unknown, but professionally present, professionally accountable, a person with a career and a darkroom, and a standard set of relationships with the institution that employed him. The photograph was his work product, in the way that all press photographs are the work product of the people who take them. It went out under his credit and into the record under his name, and whatever questions the image opened, his name remained on it. There is a quality particular to press photographs from the pre-digital era that is worth noting precisely, not to advocate for any interpretation of what the Shannon photograph shows, but to be accurate about what kind of document it is. The film negative is a physical object that records light. It can be examined, the grain of the emulsion, the exposure characteristics, the relationship between the image on the negative and the image on the print made from it. These are technical properties that could be and were assessed by people with the expertise to assess them. Authentication in that era did not mean the same thing it means now, when the question of whether an image has been digitally altered is a different kind of technical question than the one posed by a physical film negative. In 1984, the technical question was simpler in some respects, even if the interpretive question remained open in the same way. The negative was either the product of light falling through the lens onto the film in a room in Whitehall on March 21st, or it was not. Specialists in photographic analysis could say things about that question that a casual observer could not. The record of what those assessments concluded in the years following publication sits within the broader investigative record of the case, alongside Roll's incident logs, alongside the electromagnetic field measurements, alongside the accounts of the family and the responses of professional skeptics. The photograph kept moving after March 22nd. Wire transmission was not instantaneous, but it was steady, and the image continued to reach new desks in new cities in the days following its initial publication. Television news programs in several American cities aired segments about the Resch case that featured the Shannon photograph, displaying it on screen while reporters described the situation at the house on Blue Ash Road. The image appeared on television in living rooms across the country, whose occupants had no knowledge of the preceding weeks and no context beyond what the broadcast provided, which was the photograph and the description of what had been reported, and whatever weight the newscast's framing lent the story. These were ordinary news viewers watching an ordinary evening broadcast, and the image they saw was Fred Shannon's photograph, transmitted from a house on a residential street in Whitehall into their living rooms in whatever city they lived in, the handset in the air, and Tina's hands at her sides, the whole thing visible for however many seconds the broadcast held on it before moving to the next item. The broadcast record of those days is not fully preserved. Some segments exist in archival form, others may not. What is established is that the case received television coverage beyond Columbus, and that Shannon's photograph was part of that coverage, displayed on screens in cities that had no other connection to the house at 1433 Blue Ash Road. The image was doing what circulated images do, accumulating a presence in the record that was larger than the event it documented, becoming over the days following its publication something that could not be undone by any subsequent development in the case, because images circulate and the circulation has its own momentum. The Resch family, still in the house on Blue Ash Road, were not present in the newsrooms where the photograph was arriving on desks. The house looked the same from the street. The street was still a residential street in Whitehall. The photograph that Shannon had taken inside the house had traveled outward into a world the family would never fully see, into back issues of papers they did not subscribe to, into archival footage of broadcasts they never watched, into the case files of researchers and organizations that were now turning their attention toward Columbus, because the wire service had delivered the image to their desks. Among those researchers was William Roll, whose name and institutional role, director of the Psychical Research Foundation, the most credentialed American investigator of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, working at that time, placed him at the far end of the interpretive spectrum, from Randy's public skepticism. Roll had worked cases like this one before. He had methodology and a framework developed across prior casework in other cities, and when the Columbus coverage and the Shannon photograph reached him, he began the process of arranging to go to Blue Ash Road himself, a process that would bring its own kind of attention into the house, a different kind of notebook and a different kind of attention than Shannon had brought with his camera on March 21st. But that presence in the house and what it found and did not find belonged to the period that followed the photograph's publication, the weeks and months after the image had already left Columbus and taken the case with it into the wider record. What Fred Shannon left behind when he departed 1433 Blue Ash Road on March 21st, 1984, was a roll of exposed film. The images on that film were processed in the normal course of the dispatch's production cycle. The frame that showed the handset in the air was identified as the significant frame and printed and reviewed and published. The other frames from that roll, the ordinary documentation of a feature assignment, the room interiors, the establishing shots, the frames that did not show anything that would end up on a front page, those also went into the record, as all the frames of a press roll go into the record, in the archive where the dispatch's photographic files are held. The specific frame that mattered was fixed. It showed what it showed. Shannon's name was on it. The dispatch's front page was the first place it appeared. The wire service was the mechanism by which it left Columbus, and the image arrived in those other cities, on those other desks, in the hands of editors who had never heard of Blue Ash Road, who looked at a photograph of a telephone handset suspended in the air next to a 14-year-old girl's startled face, her hands at her sides, the handset simply there, at that height, in that air, and decided what to do with it. Some ran it, some noted the story, some assigned their own reporters to follow the case as it developed. The image continued outward from Columbus, continuing to be transmitted and reproduced and discussed in the days following the dispatch's editorial decision. The handset in the air in newsroom after newsroom. The case larger now than the house, larger than the street, larger than Whitehall. The photograph carrying the question it contained, the question of what had held the handset, where it was when the shutter opened, into rooms and files and broadcast archives that would hold it for decades without resolving it. The image itself still there, the handset still in the air, the question still open in the emulsion, where it has remained since the afternoon of March 21st, 1984, when Fred Shannon pressed the shutter in a house on a residential street in Columbus, and the light came through the lens and the film received it, and the image was fixed, and whatever it showed was fixed with it, and the film was carried out of the house and into the dark room, and out of the dark room and onto the front page, and out of Columbus and into the record, where it has remained, patient and unresolved, and available to anyone who wants to look at it. The handset in the air, the hands at the sides, the question neither confirmed nor dismissed, but simply there, in the photograph, the way it was on the afternoon when it was taken, the afternoon light of late March in Ohio, coming through the windows of the house on Blue Ash Road, at whatever angle it came through, the camera steady, the film in the camera, and the handset where it was. William Roll arrived in Columbus in March 1984, carrying a notebook and a methodology he had been refining for the better part of 3 decades. He was the director of the Psychical Research Foundation, a position he had held long enough that it had shaped the way he moved through a room, carefully cataloging, attentive to where people stood in relation to the things around them. He had done this work before. In 1958, he had gone to Seaford, New York, where a family named Herman had reported objects moving without contact in their house on Long Island. In 1967, he had worked a warehouse in Miami, where bottles and glass objects had reportedly moved from their shelves in the presence of a shipping clerk named Julio Vasquez. Blue Ash Road was another house in another American city, and Roll walked into it the way he had walked into the others, with the assumption that something was worth recording, and the equal assumption that recording it carefully was the only way to find out what that something was. The Resch home in March 1984 was not a quiet house. Joan and John Resch were still living inside the reports they had been making for weeks. There were foster children in the household. Tina was 14, and by the time Roll arrived, the Columbus Dispatch had already assigned a reporter and a photographer, and the story had already begun moving outward from the neighborhood in ways that a family on a residential street in Whitehall had no framework for anticipating. Roll had seen versions of this before as well. The domestic situation complicated by attention, the investigative environment shaped by the same publicity that had brought investigators there in the first place. He understood the problem. He set up his notebook and began. His methodology in the Resch home followed the approach he had developed across the cases he had worked before. Each reported incident was logged with as much specificity as the situation allowed: the time of occurrence, the room in which it happened, the object involved, its reported trajectory, and the position of each person present at the moment the thing was said to have moved. This last element was central to Roll's approach. The question that organized his documentation was not whether an object had moved, but whether, given the positions of the people in the room, any of them could have been the physical cause of its movement. The logging was slow work. The house was not slow. Reports came steadily, and Roll wrote them down in sequence, building a picture one incident at a time. The picture that emerged from that documentation, according to Roll's later published accounts, showed something he had seen in the cases before this one. The reported incidents appeared to cluster around Tina's location in the house. When Tina was in a room, objects in that room were more likely to be reported as behaving anomalously. When she moved to a different room, the center of activity appeared to shift with her. Roll had a term for this pattern: recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. RSPK was the framework he had been developing through his field investigations since Seaford, a working hypothesis that organized the pattern of poltergeist reports around a central person, typically an adolescent, whose psychological state was, in his model, somehow implicated in the physical disturbances. He used the term carefully. It was a descriptive category, not a mechanism. What it described was a pattern. What produced the pattern, he had never claimed to know for certain. The electromagnetic field measurements taken inside the Resch home during the investigation period added another layer to the record, though not a conclusive one. The measurements were intended to determine whether the home's environment contained geophysical anomalies of the kind that had occasionally been proposed as contributing factors in cases of this type, fields unusual enough to affect the behavior of objects, or in some theoretical frameworks, the perception of the people inside the building. What the measurements produced was a result that resisted simple summary. No anomaly was identified that would account for the movement of physical objects. The older residential wiring in the Blue Ash Road house produced readings consistent with its age and construction. No field was measured that clearly exceeded what the building's age and wiring would be expected to generate. And at the same time, the measurements did not produce the kind of clean, zero baseline that would rule out any environmental contribution with confidence. Inconclusive was the word that appeared in the record. It was not the first time that word had appeared in a document connected to this case, and it would not be the last. Roll worked through the incident log. The house continued to generate reports. And somewhere outside Columbus, in whatever city he was in that week, James Randi read the Columbus Dispatch coverage and began preparing a response. Randi was not a researcher who traveled to cases and filed incident logs. He was a professional skeptic, a former stage magician who had spent years documenting the techniques by which people, deliberately or otherwise, created the impression of paranormal phenomena. He had a standing cash prize challenge, well established by 1984, offering a substantial sum to anyone who could demonstrate paranormal activity under controlled conditions, conditions rigorous enough that the demonstration could not be explained by known physical or psychological mechanisms. Out, no one had claimed the prize, and in Randi's view, the Resch case was consistent with a pattern he had seen many times before: a troubled adolescent, a household under stress, the arrival of cameras and reporters that transformed ordinary domestic space into a stage on which performance became possible and perhaps inevitable. I said this publicly. He said it with the particular efficiency of someone who has made the same argument before and found that the argument does not become less true through repetition. His response to the Shannon photograph was immediate. The image, in Randi's analysis, showed nothing that required a paranormal explanation. A telephone handset in the air near a teenage girl, he argued, was entirely consistent with the girl having thrown it. The fact that her hands appeared to be at her sides did not settle the question of where they had been a moment before the shutter opened. Photography, Randi noted, was not continuous. It captured a single frame, and what happened in the fraction of a second before that frame was not captured in the image. This was a straightforward observation about photographic evidence. It was also, as Roll and others who had been in the room that day would note, not the whole of the available information. Shannon had not been there for one frame. He had been there for hours. He had been watching. What he had observed in the time surrounding the frame was part of the record as well, even if it was not what appeared in the photograph. The disagreement between Roll's position and Randi's was not a personal confrontation. They did not debate each other in the Resch home. Their divergence operated through the public record, through statements made to journalists, through the published literature each contributed to, through the frameworks each brought to the same set of reported events and arrived at opposite conclusions about. This kind of methodological divergence was, and remains, structural to cases of this type. The same incident log, the same photograph, the same family testimony, examined through Randi's lens, they composed a story about deception and media credulity. Examined through Roll's lens, they composed a provisional, carefully hedged, but genuinely open question about the limits of what was currently understood. Neither man was operating without a framework. Both frameworks were coherent. And the house on Blue Ash Road sat between them, generating neither proof nor refutation, simply generating reports. What the Resch home looked like from the inside during the peak investigative period in March and April of 1984 was something that several people have subsequently described, and their descriptions converge on a picture of considerable crowding. A two-story wood-frame house on a residential street in Whitehall is not a large space. Into that space, during the weeks following the dispatch coverage and the wire service circulation of Shannon's photograph, came reporters and photographers from the Columbus Dispatch itself, from television news programs at 2 or more local Columbus stations, from national outlets that had picked up the story through the wire services, and from various individuals with more personal interests in attending. Roll was there with research associates. Randy was not there in person, but his public statements were very much present in the conversations happening inside. Joan and John Resch were there. Tina was there. The foster children in the household were there. The house received all of these people simultaneously, or in close succession, or in shifting combinations. The occupancy of the living room and the rooms around it, changing from day to day, and sometimes from hour to hour. The effect of this on the investigative record was something that critics of Roll's methodology noted with particular attention. When a house contains television cameras, the behavior of the people in that house changes. This is not a controversial claim. It is simply what happens when people are watched, particularly when the people being watched are 14 years old and living inside an experience that has already attracted national news coverage. The chain of custody for any given reported incident, the clear documentation of who was where, what they were doing, who could see them, and what exactly happened, becomes difficult to establish under conditions of that kind. Roll's incident log was a serious attempt to maintain that chain of custody, and the log was as careful as the situation allowed. The situation, as multiple observers noted, was not controlled. It was a house in which events were reportedly happening, surrounded by people who had arrived to document them, or to dispute them, or simply to be present, and the interaction between those purposes was not something that careful notation could fully contain. The television camera operator from one of the Columbus local stations positioned equipment in one of the rooms of the Resch home during this period, adjusting the angle to keep the space around Tina within frame. The presence of the camera changed the quality of attention in the room simply by being there. This is not a statement about Tina specifically. It is a statement about rooms with cameras in them. The people present, Tina included, were aware of being observed in a way that differed from ordinary domestic awareness. The background hum of the household replaced by something more specifically directed. Roll was aware of this. He noted it. It was one of the methodological challenges he had faced before and expected to face in cases of this kind, and it did not lead him to abandon the investigation. It led him to note it as a variable in the record, alongside the times and trajectories and witness positions. The electromagnetic field meter reading, its inconclusive result in one of the Blue Ash Road rooms, was one small element of a much larger attempt to bring measurement to bear on a situation that resisted easy measurement. Roll's notebook was another such element. Shannon's photograph was another, not a measurement in the scientific sense, but a fixed record of a specific moment, chemical and physical, the silver on the emulsion holding the image of the handset in the air, and Tina's expression and the geometry of the room, the way Silver had been holding press photographs since long before anyone at the dispatch had heard of Whitehall. These documents, the notebook, the photograph, the electromagnetic readings, the incident reports made by Joan and John Resch to their church and their social networks before any investigator arrived, constituted the evidentiary record of the case, and the record was neither clean nor empty. It was complicated. It described a situation in which the same materials supported opposing readings and in which the discipline required to stay with the complication rather than resolve it prematurely in either direction was the intellectual task the case posed to anyone who tried to work through it honestly. Roll's incident log, by the end of his time in the Rage home, contained a significant number of entries. The entries were not all equivalent in their evidential weight. Some incidents had been witnessed by multiple people with clear lines of sight. Some had been reported by a single witness. Some had occurred in conditions that would have made direct physical causation by any person present quite difficult to explain. Others had occurred under conditions where the possibility of physical causation, while not directly observed, could not be ruled out. Rolls published accounts of the case, which appeared in the Journal of Parapsychology and in presentations to the Parapsychological Association in the years following the investigation, were careful to maintain these distinctions. He did not claim the entire incident log as equivalent evidence. He distinguished categories. He pointed to the subset of incidents where, in his assessment, the conditions made physical causation implausible, and he described those incidents as the core of what he considered genuinely difficult to explain. This was not a claim that the disturbances were paranormal. It was a claim that a specific subset of the documented incidents remained, after careful review, without a satisfactory conventional explanation. The notebook itself, its physical form, the handwriting on its pages, the specific incident entries, and the witness position diagrams, and the times written down in the margins, was not a dramatic object. It was a professional document in a case file that resembled other professional documents in other case files from other houses Roll had visited over the years. The Seaford case had generated similar notebooks. The Miami case had generated similar notebooks. The cases that Hans Bender had documented in Germany, which Roll referenced in his published comparative work, had generated their own records in their own languages and their own filing systems. The Resch notebook was one item in a series. What it contained was specific to Blue Ash Road, but the form in which it contained those specifics was continuous with the larger research tradition. Roll was working within a tradition that had been accumulating carefully documented cases for decades, each one generating its own record, the record persisting whether or not it produced a resolution. What Roll found in the Resch home, working through the period of his investigation, was a case that fit the pattern he had documented in the cases before it. An adolescent at the center of the reported activity, a household under significant stress, a range of incidents that varied in their evidential quality, a small subset of incidents that he considered genuinely anomalous under his standards of documentation. He placed the Resch case in the series with Seaford and Miami and the European cases he had studied. He published his placement of it there. He explained his reasoning, and across Columbus and across the country and in the offices of professional skeptics who read the same journals Roll published in, people looked at his reasoning and arrived at the same divergent positions they had held before he published. The house on Blue Ash Road remained on its street in Whitehall through all of this. The television crews eventually left. Roll completed his field work. The reporters filed their stories and moved on to other assignments. Joan and John Resch returned to the quieter version of the household they had maintained before any of this had begun. The same rooms, the same kitchen table set for more people than most neighbors would guess, the same circuit breaker panel that two separate electricians had examined and found without fault. The neighborhood outside was quiet in the way that post-war Columbus suburbs are quiet. Porch lights coming on at dusk, cars in driveways, the steady, uninflected life of a residential block where most of what happens is ordinary. But the investigation had not closed. It had simply moved into a different phase. Roll continued working with the documentation he had gathered. The journal articles would take time to prepare. The presentations to the Parapsychological Association would be scheduled and delivered. The skeptical responses would be published in turn. The case would begin its long migration from the front page of the Columbus Dispatch into the more specialized literature of poltergeist research, and its critics, where it would persist without resolution, cited by researchers who drew opposite conclusions from its record. The incident log and the photograph and the electromagnetic readings and the inconclusive results all traveling together into the archive. The house they had been gathered from continuing on its street after the note takers and camera operators and professional skeptics had all gone home. The electromagnetic field meter, packed into its case when the measurements were complete, was one of the tools that could not find what it was looking for. Not because what it was looking for was certainly absent, but because the sensitivity of the instrument, combined with the complexity of the environment, produced a result that the instrument was not equipped to resolve into clarity. This is a common experience in field investigation. The tools available are rarely adequate to the questions posed, and the gap between the question and what the available tools can measure becomes part of the record alongside the measurements themselves. Roll had been working with this gap for 30 years. He was not surprised by it. He noted it in his documentation and moved forward to the next entry in the log. What James Randi had in Randi's framework was something simpler, a photograph that proved nothing, a series of incidents none of which had been witnessed under controlled conditions, an adolescent with a documented history of behavioral difficulty, living in a household under a level of external attention that would produce performance incentives in any reasonably attentive teenager. The cash prize remained unclaimed. The conditions for claiming it, controlled observation, double-blind protocol, results replicable under scrutiny, had not been met in the Resch home, and Randi had not expected them to be. He was not unkind in his public statements. He was precise. He described what the evidence showed and what it did not show, and he noted that the gap between those two things was not itself evidence of anything unusual. It was simply a gap in the record. The gap in the record was where Roll and Randi most clearly diverged. For Randi, a gap was a gap. The absence of conclusive evidence was not evidence of anything requiring explanation, and the presence of unexplained incidents in an uncontrolled environment was exactly what one would expect in an uncontrolled environment. For Roll, a gap in the record accumulated meaning across cases. If the same pattern appeared in Seaford and in Miami and in Blue Ash Road and in the cases Hans Bender had documented in Germany, the pattern itself became a datum, something requiring explanation, not reducible to the accidents of individual uncontrolled environments. The cases were not identical, but the pattern across them was consistent enough that dismissing each one individually left the pattern unaddressed. This was the argument Roll made in his published work, carefully and at some length, and it was the argument that Randi and the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal rejected on methodological grounds, and the argument has not been resolved in the decades since either of them made it. Two investigators using documented methods arrived at incompatible conclusions from the same physical location and the same evidentiary record. This is not a statement about who was right. It is a statement about the structure of the case, which held the two positions inside it without resolving them, the way a house holds the people in its rooms without determining what they are thinking. The Blue Ash Road house was a particular house on a particular street in Whitehall, and what had happened inside it in March and April of 1984 had been documented as carefully as the conditions of the investigation allowed. The documentation survived. The case survived in the documentation. Roll's notebook was a physical object that would eventually become an archival object, the way all physical objects that are preserved eventually do, moved from the active file to the shelf, held in whatever institution holds the Psychical Research Foundation's records, available to whoever knows where to look for it. The television camera operator, who adjusted the frame to keep Tina in shot, had produced footage as well. Not only the footage that would later complicate the record, but earlier footage, long, uninteresting minutes of a girl in a chair, in a domestic room, while adults moved carefully around her and wrote things down. That footage existed. It had the fixed quality that recorded material has. It would show what it showed, regardless of how the people depicted in it felt about being shown, regardless of what interpretive framework the viewer brought to it, regardless of whether the investigation it was gathered during ever reached a conclusion. The camera had been in the room had been in the camera, and the recording persisted, the way recordings do, available to be looked at again from any distance. There is something specific about a case that produces this kind of multiplied documentation. The photograph, and the notebook, and the electromagnetic readings, and the incident log, and the television footage, and the published journal articles, and the skeptical responses in the newsletters, and then fails to resolve. The documentation does not produce resolution. It produces a more fully documented irresolution. Roll knew this. Randy knew this in his own framework. The journalists who had filed their stories and moved on knew this in a less structured way. The story did not have an ending, so the story did not end so much as it simply stopped being updated, the way stories without endings do. The house on Blue Ash Road was left holding the documentation of its own irresolution, the way it had been left holding the circuit breaker panel that two electricians had examined and found without fault, and the lights that had continued to flicker after both of them had gone. In the rooms of the Regin home, during the weeks when investigators and camera crews and reporters were present, there was a quality of sustained and slightly bewildered attention that the case produced in everyone who came into contact with it closely. Roll brought his training and his prior cases and his careful methodology. The television crews brought their equipment and their editorial instincts and their awareness of what made footage usable. Randy brought his framework and his cash prize and his long experience of cases that looked from the outside like this one. Joan and John Resch brought the simple fact of having been the people present before any of the others arrived, the ones who had watched the lights flicker before any investigator had made the first entry in the first log, and who would be present again after the notebooks were filled and filed and the camera operators had packed their equipment and driven back to their stations. Tina was 14 and at the center of something she had not chosen and could not, from inside it, see clearly. She was in the chair in the room. She was the person around whom the documented pattern appeared to cluster. Whatever she understood about that, she understood it from the inside, which is not the same as understanding it from the outside. And the investigation could not access what she understood from the inside. It could only log the incidents that clustered around her position and note the times and the trajectories and the witness configurations and leave the interior entirely undocumented, the way the interior always is. Roll's field notebook, by the time the peak investigative period ended and the house on Blue Ash Road began returning to something closer to its ordinary configuration, contained what it contained, the careful, undramatic accumulation of a working investigator's attempt to bring documentation to bear on a situation that produced, in the end, a result consistent with all of his prior cases, a record that was real, an explanation that was not settled, and a pattern that persisted across the record without resolving into either confirmation or refutation, simply persisting, the way patterns do, waiting for an instrument sensitive enough to read them clearly. The street outside was quiet. The porch light came on at dusk. The neighbors went about their ordinary business in their ordinary houses. none of them aware of the notebooks being filled inside the wood frame house on the corner, the incident log growing longer entry by entry, the electromagnetic readings filed in a folder alongside the times and the positions and the objects and the questions that the documentation had been gathered to answer and had not, in the end, answered. Roll closed his notebook for the last time in that house and prepared to leave. The house looked the same from the street that it had looked on the day he arrived. Inside, the investigation had run its full course. Outside, nothing had changed. The street was the same street. The neighborhood was the same neighborhood. The distance between what the investigation had gathered and what it had resolved was approximately the same distance it had been when Roll had walked in the door with his methodology and his prior cases and his 3 decades of careful work. And the distance was not smaller for having been carefully documented, but it was at least now held in a notebook, specific and dated, the handwriting of someone who had tried to measure it as accurately as the available tools allowed. The footage exists somewhere. It is held in whatever archive or storage format survived the decade in which it was recorded. A piece of videotape from a Columbus television crew that spent time in the Blue Ash Roadhouse during the spring of 1984. What the tape shows, in the section that became relevant to investigators afterward, is a specific moment. Tina Resch's hand reaching toward a table lamp, the lamp going over, and then her hands returning to her sides, her expression shifting into something that read, in the footage, as surprise. When investigators reviewed that section of tape and brought it to Tina, she acknowledged what it showed. She said that the pressure of being watched, of having cameras in the rooms of the house for days on end, had produced in her a kind of breaking point, a moment in which she had manufactured something because the observation had become unbearable and she had wanted it to produce a result. The acknowledgement was plain. The tape was what it was. That admission entered the record. It stayed there. It did not close the record, because the record was already larger than that one moment, but it became part of what anyone reading the case had to account for, a specific documented episode in which something reported as spontaneous had been shown in footage to be produced deliberately. James Randi had been arguing since March that the case was consistent with a troubled adolescent performing deliberate deceptions for attention. The lamp footage gave his position a concrete anchor, a piece of physical evidence he could point to alongside the theoretical framework he had already built. The footage and the acknowledgement were incorporated into skeptical accounts of the case and remained there, in print and in subsequent documentary treatments, as the clearest factual point around which the 2 competing interpretations of the Blue Ash Road events arranged themselves. William Roll, who had spent more time in the house than any other investigator, received the lamp footage as additional information rather than as a definitive conclusion. His framework for the case had always involved a distinction between incidents that could be explained by direct physical causation, Tina, or another person present, reaching out and moving an object, and a subset of incidents that he argued had occurred under conditions where that explanation was significantly harder to establish. The lamp footage sat in the first category. It documented a manufactured incident. It did not, in Roll's analysis, address the incidents in the other category, the ones he had logged at times, and in configurations where the witness positions and the object trajectories had not aligned with what a deliberate physical action from Tina's location would have produced. He said this plainly in his published work. The footage was part of the record, so were the other incidents. He held both. What Roll produced from his time at the Blue Ash Roadhouse was a systematic account, incident by incident, time and location and witness configuration, of events spread across the weeks he spent there and across the period of the family's own reports before investigators arrived. The notebook he kept during the investigation became the basis for a published account in the Journal of Parapsychology, which meant that the Resch case entered the formal parapsychological literature, not as a news story or a popular account, but as a documented field investigation written by the most credentialed American researcher in the specific discipline of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. The journal article was peer-reviewed within its field. It cited the methodology Roll had developed across prior cases. It placed the Blue Ash Road events in a comparative context alongside other cases he had investigated and considered significant. It was published. It was cited. It went into the archive of a literature that has continued to develop since the 1980s, and the Resch case remained in that literature, listed in the index, referenced in surveys, cross-referenced to the cases Roll considered analogous. Roll's published work on the Resch events drew explicit comparisons to the Seaford, New York poltergeist investigation of 1958, a case that had predated his involvement in the field, but that he had studied extensively, and to the Miami warehouse case of 1967, in which he had been a primary investigator. He also placed the Blue Ash Road case alongside European documentation, noting parallels with cases investigated by Hans Bender, a German researcher whose work on poltergeist phenomena was among the most substantial in the European literature. The effect of this comparative framing was to situate the Resch case inside a cumulative research tradition, to treat it not as a singular event, but as an instance of a pattern that Roll and others had been documenting across decades, in different countries, under varying conditions. Whether that tradition constituted evidence of something genuinely anomalous or represented a sustained failure of investigative rigor across multiple researchers and multiple cultures depended entirely on which interpretive framework the reader brought to it. The tradition itself was documented. The cases were in the literature. The question of what they documented had not been resolved. The Seaford case had its own record. The family, the house, the investigators, the reported incidents, the eventual explanations proposed and not accepted. It sat in archives and in Roll's published summaries and in the popular literature that had grown up around it. The Miami case was similarly documented, similarly contested, similarly incorporated into both the parapsychological literature and the skeptical literature as a data point for opposing arguments. When Roll grouped these cases together with the Blue Ash Road events, he was describing a pattern he had spent his professional life investigating, a pattern in which reported object movement in a domestic space appeared to cluster around a specific individual, typically adolescent, typically in a period of personal stress, typically in a household where other life pressures were already present. The pattern was what he called recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. Whether the pattern represented a real phenomenon or a persistent category of misidentification and investigator error was the question that had not been answered in Seaford, had not been answered in Miami, and had not been answered in Columbus. The Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, which Randy was associated with and which published a skeptical journal covering cases of this kind, addressed the Resch investigation in its literature. The CSI Cop account placed the case in the context of what the organization argued were structural failures in parapsychological field methodology, the absence of controlled conditions, the difficulty of maintaining chain of custody for incidents reported in active households, the problem of observer bias, and the specific complication created by media presence, which the skeptical account argued incentivized performance by creating an audience for reported events. The lamp footage was incorporated into this account as illustrative evidence. The CSICOP position was that the Resch case demonstrated the same pattern of methodological failure the organization argued characterized parapsychological field investigation, generally not a specific fraud to be exposed, but a systematic inability to distinguish between genuine anomaly and human performance under conditions of insufficient control. Both bodies of literature, the parapsychological and the skeptical, absorbed the Resch case and made use of it. It appeared in Roll's published surveys as a significant RSPK case. It appeared in CSICOP publications as a case study in media credulity and investigative limitation. The case existed simultaneously inside two interpretive traditions that had reached opposite conclusions from the same set of documented events, and neither tradition had produced evidence sufficient to dislodge the other. This was not an unusual situation for cases of this kind. It was, in fact, the characteristic situation of cases that entered both bodies of literature. The evidence was insufficient to confirm the anomalous interpretation, and also insufficient to establish that nothing anomalous had occurred. The record held both interpretations, and neither displaced the other, and the case remained in both indexes, cited in both traditions, the question formally and openly unresolved. Fred Shannon's photograph continued to exist in this condition. The image, the handset in the air, Tina's expression, her hands at her sides, was reproduced in documentary treatments of the case, analyzed in written accounts from both interpretive traditions, discussed in terms of what the film medium could and could not authenticate, and held open as a document that had never been definitively explained in either direction. It was not the only piece of visual evidence associated with the case, but it was the most circulated one. The image that had gone out over the wire services in March 1984 and landed on desks in newsrooms that had never heard of the Blue Ash Roadhouse. The image that had given the Resch case its national and international reach in the first place. Shannon's professional credibility as a working newspaper photographer was part of its record. The film negative was part of its record. The fact that it had been taken on standard press equipment in a prior era of photographic authentication before digital manipulation became a standard concern was part of its record. None of these facts resolve the question of what the handset was doing in the air at the moment the shutter closed. They were simply the conditions under which the image existed, and the image continued to exist in them, reproduced and examined, and discussed and not resolved. The documentary film that revisited the case, titled simply Tina, approached the Blue Ash Road events from a distance of years, interviewing surviving participants, reviewing the available record, and attempting to hold the 1984 events in a frame that did justice to their complexity. The Shannon photograph appeared in the film. The lamp footage appeared. Roll's investigative work was described. Tina herself, who had by the time of the documentary's production lived through circumstances well beyond the spring of 1984, was a subject of the film's attention in a way that required the filmmakers to think carefully about what the poltergeist case had been part of a larger life, a life that the 1984 events had touched in ways that included the sudden arrival of national media, the sustained presence of investigators and camera crews, and the specific pressure of being the person around whom the reported disturbances were documented to cluster. The film brought renewed journalistic attention to the case. It sought out the people who had been present, investigators, family members, observers, and gathered their accounts decades after the events they were describing. The result was a treatment that acknowledged both the lamp footage and the broader investigative record, and that did not attempt to collapse the case into a single explanation. Roll, by the time the documentary was made, had spent decades working in the field he had entered before the Resch case and continued after it. The Blue Ash Road investigation was one of many. It was also, in terms of media reach and public attention, one of the most widely known cases he had investigated, partly because of the Shannon photograph, partly because of the timing of the Columbus Dispatch coverage, and partly because the case had happened in the particular cultural moment of the early 1980s when public interest in paranormal phenomena was running in a certain direction, and media appetite for cases of this kind was considerable. Roll's comparative analysis placed the Resch events in a longer and quieter tradition than the media coverage had suggested, a tradition of field investigation going back decades, conducted by researchers in multiple countries, producing a body of case documentation that had accumulated in journals and archives and conference proceedings without ever having produced the kind of controlled experimental evidence that would have settled the fundamental question. Roll knew this. He wrote about it. The Resch case, like the Seaford case and the Miami case and the European cases documented by Bender, remained in the literature as documented and contested. Interesting for what it contributed to the pattern, unresolved as to what the pattern meant. The Blue Ash Road house continued to exist on its residential street in the Whitehall area of Columbus after the investigators and the cameras had gone. It was a 2-story wood frame house in a post-war suburban neighborhood, the kind of house where porch lights came on at dusk and where the street outside was ordinarily quiet. The events of March and April 1984 had occurred inside it, and after those events the house remained, the street remained, the neighborhood remained, the case moved into the archive, the house stayed on the block. These are simply two separate facts about the same address, and they continue to be true simultaneously, the house in Whitehall and the case in the literature, each persisting in its own form. There is something particular about the way this kind of case persists. It does not resolve in the archive the way a court case resolves, with a formal conclusion and a closed file. It accumulates additional accounts, additional commentary, additional reproduction of the primary documents. The Shannon photograph gets reproduced. The lamp footage gets described. Roll's published account gets cited. The CSICOP response gets cited in turn. New documentary treatments add new interviews. Researchers working in the field encounter the case through Roll's published surveys and read it in the context he provided, cross-referenced to Seaford and Miami and the European literature. Researchers working in the skeptical tradition encounter it through CSICOP documentation and read it in the context that tradition provided, as an instance of the methodological failures that make field investigation of this kind unreliable as evidence. Both traditions continue. Both sets of readers continue to encounter the case. The record accumulates around it without closing it, and the case continues to occupy its place in both indexes, listed and cross-referenced and not resolved. This is, in a sense, the characteristic condition of cases that resist the available explanatory frameworks. The evidence is insufficient to confirm the anomalous interpretation. The evidence is also insufficient to establish with certainty that the anomalous interpretation is wrong. The gap between these two insufficiencies is where cases like the Resch investigation persist, not as open wounds, not as urgent mysteries demanding resolution, but as documented instances of something reported to have happened in a specific house on a specific street in Columbus, Ohio. In the spring of 1984, something that was observed by named investigators using documented methods, something that was photographed by a working newspaper photographer on standard press film, something that produced a body of record which has been in continuous existence since the investigation closed, and which has not been satisfactorily explained in either direction. The case is in the record is in the archive. The archive is in whatever libraries and storage systems and digital catalogs hold these kinds of materials, and it will be there when the people who were present in the house in 1984 are no longer able to speak about what they saw. Roll's field notebook from the Blue Ash Road investigation. The handwritten log of incidents, times, locations, witness configurations was the first layer of the written record. The journal article was the second. The conference presentations were the third. The responses from the skeptical literature were fourth and fifth, and beyond, proliferating as the case was absorbed into ongoing debates about investigative methodology and evidential standards. Each layer of response created the conditions for the next. The case grew a literature the way cases that resist resolution tend to do, not because they are resolved, but because they continue to generate the need for response, and each response becomes part of the record that subsequent respondents then need to address. The handwritten notebook and the typeset journal article cross-reference each other. The journal article and the CS-ICOP response cross-reference each other. The documentary film cross-references all of the above. The record is layered, and the layers are thick, and the address at the bottom of all of them is still 1433 Blue Ash Road, Whitehall, Columbus, Ohio, a house on a residential street in a post-war suburb where something was reported to have happened in March and April of 1984. The specific texture of what was reported matters to the record in a way that summaries tend to flatten. The lights going on and off in multiple rooms with no one at the switches. The lamp tilting and falling with no one standing near it. The telephone handset appearing to lift and travel from its cradle. The cup moving across a surface. The small appliances activating without being touched. These were the specific reported events described in family accounts and logged by Roll during his investigation, each one ordinary in itself. A lamp, a phone, a cup, the lights in a room, and strange only in the reported manner of its movement. The strangeness was not in the objects. The objects were the furniture of an ordinary suburban house. The strangeness was in what witnesses reported about the relationship between the objects and the physical forces that should have been holding them in place. A lamp stays on a surface because gravity holds it there. A telephone handset stays in its cradle because no one has lifted it. These are the baseline conditions of a furnished room. What was reported at Blue Ash Road was a suspension of those baseline conditions, temporary and repetitive, and apparently clustered around the location of one 14-year-old girl in the house. Roll had seen this pattern before. That was the point of his comparative work. The pattern had appeared in Seaford, in Miami, in the European cases he cited, and it had appeared again in Columbus. Whether the pattern was evidence of a genuine physical phenomenon or evidence of a persistent human tendency to misperceive and misreport in conditions of domestic stress, or evidence of systematic failures in the methodology of field investigation, depended on interpretive commitments that the evidence itself was not sufficient to determine. Roll believed the pattern was evidence of something genuinely anomalous. Randy believed it was evidence of a performance by a troubled adolescent in conditions of insufficient investigative control. The Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal believed it was evidence of the broader failure of parapsychological field methodology. Each position was documented, each was argued at length in published literature. None was established beyond the objections of the others, and the case continued to sit in the space between them, documented from multiple angles, explained by none. The journal volume that contains Roll's published account of the Resch investigation is held in whatever libraries keep back issues of the Journal of Parapsychology, a specialized publication, but a real one, with a documented history and a peer review process within its field. The volume with the Resch article is on a shelf somewhere or in a digital archive, the pages printed and bound the way academic journals are printed and bound, the text set in the standard format of a journal article with its citations and its methodology section and its careful, specific language of a field investigation written up for professional review. The Seaford case is cited, the Miami case is cited, Hans Bender's European documentation is cited. The Blue Ash Roadhouse appears in the citations as the location for the specific series of incidents described in the article. Its street address, a bibliographic fact. The house itself, anchoring the abstract claims about recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis in the physical reality of a two-story wood frame building on a residential street in Columbus, Ohio. The fact that the case remains in the literature is itself a kind of answer to one of the questions that was most contested about it in 1984, the question of whether it was serious, whether it deserved sustained investigative attention, whether the reported events were worth documenting in the systematic way. Roll chose to document them. The case stayed in the literature because researchers continued to find it worth citing in both directions. It was cited as significant by those who found Roll's methodology credible and his comparative analysis persuasive. It was cited as instructive by those who found the lamp footage damning and Randy's framework compelling. In neither case was it dismissed as too slight to merit attention. The sustained engagement of both traditions with the Blue Ash Road events is itself a fact of the record. The case was interesting enough, complicated enough, and resistant enough to easy resolution that it continued to generate response long after the spring of 1984, long after the cameras left the house, long after the investigators packed their notebooks and went back to wherever they had come from. The lamp footage and the acknowledgement exist in the record, alongside Roll's subset of incidents that he argued could not be as easily accounted for by direct physical causation. These two parts of the record do not cancel each other. They coexist. A person can manufacture one incident and not have manufactured another. The lamp footage established that Tina had, at least one point, produced a physical effect and presented it as spontaneous. It did not establish that every reported incident during the investigation period had the same origin. Roll's analysis acknowledged the manufactured incident and continued to hold the other logged events as part of an open question. The skeptical analysis incorporated the manufactured incident as the most direct evidence available and argued that it was characteristic rather than exceptional, that the investigative conditions made it impossible to establish the cause of any other reported incident with sufficient confidence to treat it as anomalous. Both arguments were made in published literature. Both had their logic. Neither resolved the question. The photograph and the footage in the field notebook, in the journal article, in the CS ICOP response, in the documentary film are all, in the end, layers of a record that documents a spring in a house in Columbus, Ohio. They document it from different angles and with different purposes, and in service of different interpretive positions. And together they constitute something that is neither proof of a paranormal event nor proof of a sustained fraud, but simply the most complete available account of what was reported, what was investigated, and what remains, after decades, without a satisfying explanation. The house on Blue Ash Road was a two-story wood frame house on a residential street in Whitehall. The lights in it flickered in March 1984, with no one at the switches. A telephone handset was photographed in the air near the face of a 14-year-old girl with a Columbus Dispatch press photographer's hand on the shutter A field investigator spent weeks in the house logging incidents in a notebook he later published. The footage showed something that was admitted to have been manufactured. The record of other incidents remained open. These are the facts of the case as it survives in the literature, and they have been in the archive for 40 years now, and no one has produced an account that explains them fully and satisfies both the parapsychological tradition and the skeptical one, and the case remains where cases like it tend to remain, documented, cited, unresolved, and available to anyone who goes to the shelf and opens the volume to the right page. There is a quietness to things that have been in the archive a long time. The urgency of 1984, the front page of the Columbus Dispatch, the wire services, the television crews, Randy's rapid public response, the compressed intensity of an investigation conducted in a house full of cameras and competing methodologies. That urgency dissipated as March became April, and April became the months and years that followed. What remained was the record, in the calm condition that records settle into when the events that generated them have passed. The journal article is on its shelf. The field notebook is wherever Roll kept his research materials. The documentary film is in whatever distribution format it occupies now. The Shannon photograph is in the Dispatch archive and in reproduction in documentary treatments and on the screens of researchers and journalists and people with an interest in cases of this kind who encounter it through whatever path leads them to it. The phone caught in the air in the image has been in that position since the shutter closed on March 21st, 1984, and it will remain there in the image for as long as the image survives, which is likely to be a long time. Roll's published survey of poltergeist cases, with its chapter on the Blue Ash Road events, sits in the library the way it has always sat, the binding intact or worn, depending on how many times it has been pulled from the shelf, the pages yellow or white, depending on the paper stock and the years, the text still legible, the citations still accurate, the methodology still described in the careful language Roll used to describe it. The Resch case is listed in the index. The page numbers are there. Someone could go to that library, find the volume, open it to the index, locate the page, and read Roll's account of the house on Blue Ash Road. The incidents logged, the witness configurations, the comparative references to Seaford and Miami, and the European literature, the careful language of a researcher who found in the pattern something worth documenting and spent a significant part of his professional life in the documentation of it. The account would be exactly as Roll left it. The case would be exactly as it was when he closed the investigation. The Blue Ash Roadhouse would still be on its street in Whitehall, unremarkable from the outside, its porch light going on at dusk the way it always did, the neighborhood around it quiet in the particular way of post-war residential streets in the middle of the country on an ordinary night. The investigation is not ongoing. The spring of 1984 has been over for 40 years.